Kwesi had always lived a life of quiet expectations. In his small village nestled between rolling green hills and dusty roads in Western Africa, everyone knew who he was and what he was destined to become. His parents, well-respected members of the community, had poured everything they had into his education and upbringing. They expected greatness, or at the very least, a respectable and stable future, the kind that would carry the family name forward with pride. By the time he reached his late 20s, Kwesi was known as a man of good morals, quiet ambition, and deep faith. He volunteered at the church, helped his aging father with the family's modest cocoa farm, and often tutored younger children in the village who struggled with their studies. Life was simple, and though not without hardship, it offered him structure. There was a sense of certainty in his future, or so he thought. Then came Zola. It was an unremarkable Sunday when their paths first crossed. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the village church, scattering warm colors across the stone floor. Kwesi arrived early, as he often did, and took his usual seat near the center aisle. The air smelled faintly of incense and aging wood. The congregation filled in gradually, the familiar hum of voices and shuffling feet marking the beginning of another worship day. The choir rose to sing, and that's when he noticed her. Zola stood near the back of the group, her eyes closed, her voice soft but steady. She wasn't someone one could ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence was unspoken power. Her skin bore the unmistakable signs of a severe condition, large patches of discoloration, thickened textures, and scars that ran along her arms and neck. Her face, too, was marked in a way that society often deemed unpleasant or unfortunate. Kwesi, like everyone else, saw the difference, but unlike most, he didn't look away. There was something in the way Zola stood, unashamed and present, that moved him. Despite the quiet tension around her, the glances exchanged between churchgoers, and the subtle space people left between themselves and her, she sang with calmness, not for attention, not to prove anything, but because it was part of her. Her voice was hauntingly beautiful. It wasn't polished or classically trained, but it carried emotion in every note. There was pain in it, yes, but also peace, a rare combination that seemed to speak to something deeper than words. From that day forward, something shifted inside Kwesi. He found himself returning to church not just out of habit or devotion, but anticipation. He began noticing her more, the way she lingered after service to help clean up when others rushed to leave, the way she offered her seat to elderly women without hesitation, the way children stared and she smiled at them anyway. He saw over and over again small acts of grace that seemed invisible to others, but burned into his mind. Zola didn't speak much. She often kept to herself, eyes lowered, hands busy. But Kwesi began finding reasons to speak with her. He asked her questions about the choir, offered to help carry hymn books, and once even walked her halfway home after an evening rehearsal. Each interaction was brief, but left an impression. He learned she lived alone, in a modest home made of worn bricks and tin roofing at the edge of the village. She survived on whatever job she could find, cleaning, weaving, odd tasks from kind neighbors. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had no siblings to lean on. The skin condition she carried was not contagious, but misunderstood. It had isolated her for most of her life. She had once been enrolled in school, but had dropped out in her teens due to bullying and the constant stares. And yet, through all of that, she had become a woman of quiet strength. She had found her faith, not in a moment of revelation, but in long years of solitude and prayer. Her spirituality wasn't loud or performative. It was rooted in endurance. That, more than anything, drew Kwesi to her. At first, Zola was cautious. She had encountered kindness before, only to have it followed by rejection. There were those who pretended to care, who offered sympathy wrapped in pity, who made her feel like a burden rather than a person. She had learned to keep her distance, to protect herself with silence and minimal expectation. Kwesi, however, was different. He never asked about her condition. He never offered empty praise or talked about how brave she was. Instead, he treated her like anyone else. They spoke about small things, the weather, the choir, the sermon. Slowly, the conversations deepened. He asked about her childhood, her favorite books, her dreams. Zola found herself answering, surprised at how easy it was to talk to him. He listened without judgment, laughed easily, and always kept his word. Months passed, and their connection solidified. They began to spend time together outside of church, walks along the riverbank, shared meals under a mango tree, moments of quiet reflection where words weren't needed. People in the village began to take notice. Some were surprised, others were suspicious. Whispers began to follow them. But Kwesi didn't care. He had fallen in love, not with Zola's story, not with her suffering, but with her soul. He loved the way she found beauty in ordinary things. He loved the way she challenged him to see the world differently. He loved how, despite everything, she chose hope. Zola, slowly but surely, allowed herself to feel the same. She stopped waiting for the day he would walk away. She stopped doubting the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in years, she began to imagine a future with someone else in it. What they shared was delicate but powerful. It wasn't marked by dramatic declarations or grand gestures. It was built through consistency, respect, and shared faith. It was a love that asked for nothing but gave everything. And though neither of them could fully foresee what lay ahead, the rejection, the poverty, the loneliness, in that moment, they were simply two people who had found each other in a world that tried its best to keep them apart. Their story had just begun. After months of slow building trust, shared silences, and sacred rituals of connection, Kwesi and Zola had entered a stage of love that no longer required testing. For both of them, the certainty of what they had become undeniable. Kwesi knew that what he felt for Zola wasn't just admiration or affection. It was the kind of love rooted in respect, shared values, and the desire to build something together. And Zola, once so guarded, began to feel safe enough to let her heart open fully. Yet even as their bond deepened, a heavy shadow loomed, the knowledge that Kwesi's family still didn't know about her. In Kwesi's village, family approval wasn't a tradition, it was a mandate. Marriage was more than personal choice. It was a communal contract, sealed with pride and approval from both lineages. Parents had a powerful say, and deviation from expectations often meant more than just disappointment. It meant exile from the familial fold. Kwesi knew this. He also knew that Zola, with her visible skin condition and her solitary life on the margins, would not be received easily. But he could not, and would not, keep her a secret. After much prayer and reflection, he decided it was time to bring Zola into the light of his family. He told his parents, Ayodele and Ama, about her. He explained her character, her humility, her courage, and her faith. He painted the picture of the woman he had come to love, choosing every word with care. His parents listened, nodding politely, their expressions unreadable. His mother's eyes narrowed slightly when he mentioned Zola's condition. His father's brows furrowed. Ayodele, a man of strong opinions and rigid cultural values, was silent for a moment before speaking. He didn't ask about Zola's education or her family background. He asked, "What does her face look like?" The question wasn't cruel, but it was laced with the sort of calculation Kwesi had feared. He knew what his father was really asking. Would she bring shame upon us? Kwesi insisted that Zola's appearance did not define her, But even before he finished speaking, he could feel the rejection beginning to brew in the room. His mother, once soft-spoken, became sharp in her concern. She feared the whispers from churchgoers, the stares from the market, the judgment of relatives. They reminded him of his duty to marry well, to preserve the family's reputation, to not throw his life away. But Kwesi had already made his choice. He invited them to meet Zola in person. Perhaps, he reasoned, seeing her face to face, hearing her voice, witnessing her grace, might shift their hearts. His parents agreed, though reluctantly. The meeting took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Zola had cooked a humble meal of jollof rice and grilled fish, preparing her home with care, not out of performance, but out of respect. She wore a patterned kente dress, modest and beautiful. Her face was calm, though her hands trembled slightly as they waited. When Ayodele and Amma arrived, the tension was instant. Though polite, their discomfort was barely hidden. Amma's eyes darted over Zola's face, lingering too long while Ayodele asked short, clipped questions with forced courtesy. Zola answered each one calmly, but it was clear. The judgment had already been cast. Afterward, his parents left abruptly. The following day, they summoned Kwesi to their home, where they expressed their final decision. They forbade the relationship. Not out of cruelty, they claimed, but out of protection. She will never be accepted, they said. People will talk. Children will stare. You will ruin your future. We raised you for more. Kwesi's response, though measured, made clear that he would not be turning away from Zola. That night, he packed his few belongings and returned to her. He knew that this choice, though grounded in love, had cost him everything he once knew. The fallout was swift. Kwesi's name disappeared from family discussions. His siblings stopped visiting. His uncle, who had promised to help him secure a government job, rescinded the offer. His pastor, too, pulled him aside and gently advised him to reconsider. Some members of the church avoided him altogether, quietly pushing Zola out of the choir. The village, which once saw Kwesi as a promising son, now regarded him with confusion, even pity. But none of this compared to what Zola endured. Her presence in Kwesi's life turned her into a symbol of rebellion. Where before she was quietly ignored, now she was openly judged. Some people accused her of bewitching Kwesi. Others suggested she had manipulated him out of desperation. Children were told not to approach her. Vendors raised prices when she tried to buy food. Strangers muttered curses under their breath as she passed. Kwesi stood by her through all of it. When the whispers became louder than the prayers, when invitations stopped coming, and neighbors shut their doors, he remained. He didn't lash out, didn't try to prove anything. He simply continued loving Zola, choosing her day after day. They began speaking of marriage, but with his parents refusing to attend and no family to bless the union, it was a challenge. Still, they pressed on. They planned a small ceremony in a borrowed church hall. When it became clear that Kwesi's parents would not come, he asked an older couple from the outskirts of town, friends of Zola's late parents, to stand in as family. They agreed, moved by the love they saw between the couple. Their wedding was humble but filled with meaning. There were no expensive decorations, no feasting crowds. But in that quiet hall, surrounded by a handful of people who believed in their love, Kwesi and Zola became husband and wife. After the wedding, rejection only intensified. Kwesi's parents told others not to associate with the couple. They spread word through family channels that he was no longer to be consulted on family matters. He was no longer one of them. But he and Zola pressed forward. The home they returned to was not built on brick or approval. It was built on loyalty and sacrifice. They knew the road ahead would be hard, but they had each other. That was enough to start. Kwesi and Zola's wedding had come and gone, not with loud celebration, but with quiet defiance and steady hearts. While other couples danced through lavish receptions and posed before flowered arches surrounded by dozens of well-wishers, Kwesi and Zola exchanged their vows in a modest church hall with borrowed decorations, a borrowed dress, and barely enough food to serve their handful of guests. Yet the vows had been real. The love had been absolute. But once the wedding ended, so did any illusion that life would be easy. Kwesi's parents had made good on their word. They cut him off from every tie of support. The family home, which he had once hoped to inherit, was reclaimed and later sold by his father without his knowledge. With no savings and no job, Kwesi had no choice but to move with Zola into a rented room in a run-down building near the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from what he had imagined for himself. A small, crumbling structure with a rusted tin roof, uneven floors, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. The kitchen was nothing more than a charcoal stove outside the door, and their only source of water was a public tap several meters away. Rent was a constant pressure. Though their landlord was initially lenient, Grace Worth-Thinnis' payments grew inconsistent. Kwesi searched constantly for work. He applied for teaching posts, offered to tutor privately, and even tried daily labor. But every opportunity slipped away. Rumors about his marriage had followed him, and the fear or discomfort people felt toward Zola extended to him too. Zola did what she could. She began sewing small accessories, purses made from scrap fabric, simple clothes for children. She sold them at the market, where customers were few and suspicious. Many people avoided her stall altogether, assuming she was cursed or ill. Yet she returned every day, under the hot sun, waiting patiently with her items neatly displayed. They learned to survive with less. One meal a day became the norm. Breakfasts were often skipped, and dinner sometimes meant nothing more than boiled cassava and salt. When food ran out, they prayed, not always for miracles, but for strength. They prayed to stay grounded in the love that had brought them together. Yet within the bare walls of their rented room, there was something remarkable. Joy. Zola filled their tiny space with color and warmth. She hung pieces of kitenge cloth across the walls to brighten the dull, cracked plaster. She swept every morning, polished their few belongings until they shone, and brought home little plants she found growing wild. Kwesi, despite the daily defeats, always managed to make her smile, with silly stories, awkward dances, or just sitting beside her when words failed. At night, they often lay side by side under a thin sheet, dreaming aloud of a better future. Zola spoke of building a small soap-making business. She had learned the basics from an elder years ago and believed she could revive it. Kwesi dreamed of having his own tutoring center, a place where children from all backgrounds could learn without shame or bias. And they both dreamed of a house, a modest one, a place that was truly theirs, where they could start a family and grow old in peace. Children remained a distant thought. Though they both wanted them, they had agreed to wait. Their lives, as they stood, were too unstable, too precarious. Zola often worried about bringing a child into a world that had already shown such cruelty toward her. Kwesi reassured her, but deep inside, he, too, felt the weight of that fear. Despite everything, their love endured. It wasn't without strain. There were arguments born from hunger, exhaustion, and the sting of rejection. There were days when the silence between them was heavy. Days when Kwesi felt his hope cracking beneath the surface. Days when Zola felt unworthy, as if her love had cost Kwesi everything. But even in their worst moments, they never considered walking away. One morning, after months of hardship, a small shift arrived. A woman from the market, one who had once refused to speak to Zola, returned to her stall, this time with curiosity instead of judgment. She bought one of Zola's handmade purses and praised its stitching. It was a single sale, one item. But for Zola, it felt like a new beginning. Kwesi took it as a sign. He redoubled his efforts, offering free tutoring sessions to a few neighborhood children. Word spread slowly. People began to notice his patience, his kindness. Another parent asked for help, then another. Their days were still filled with struggle, but the light at the end of the tunnel, once just an imagined hope, now seemed like something real, distant but reachable. Brick by brick, step by step, they were carving a path forward, not through luck or privilege, but through pure, unbreakable resilience. Kwesi and Zola's life, shaped by loss and sacrifice, had become a quiet but unshakable force, a kind of love story that defied the world's shallow expectations and judgments. Over time, the couple began to build something more than survival. They started creating a future rooted in self-reliance and dignity. The business Zola had once dreamed of, making natural soap using local herbs and oils, started to take shape. She began with just a few ingredients and handmade labels, selling her products at a tiny wooden stand she and Kwesi built themselves. Customers came slowly, but they came. Some were intrigued by the quality. Others were moved by the story they had heard in whispers, a love story unlike any they had ever seen. Kwesi's free tutoring program had also started to grow. What had begun with 2 neighborhood children turned into a group of 10, then 20. Some families started offering small payments, and others gave gifts, yams, rice, oil, anything they could afford. With these bits of income and support, Kwesi and Zola began to save. One afternoon, while walking home from the market, Zola passed a dusty patch of land near a hillside. The property was unclaimed, overgrown, and barely accessible. But to her, it felt like possibility. That evening, she brought Kwesi to see it. They stood there in silence, imagining their future home. Over the next year, they poured every bit of money they could save into purchasing the land and preparing it for a house. It wasn't fast. Progress came in pieces. They bought 1 bag of cement at a time. Friends Kwesi had tutored helped mix mortar. A retired mason, moved by their story, offered to guide them free of charge. Bit by bit, the walls began to rise. Their story slowly reached beyond their village. A traveling journalist visited their town to cover stories of resilience and love. She met Kwesi and Zola, spent time in their home, and documented their journey. The video she made was uploaded to a community platform, and then it spread. Strangers from across the country began sending messages. Some offered encouragement, others donations, and a few shared their own stories of overcoming rejection and isolation. The couple didn't let the sudden attention distract them. They remained grounded, pouring everything back into their dream. Eventually, the house was finished, a small 2-room home with a garden out front and a narrow porch where they often sat and watched the sunset. It wasn't a palace, but it was theirs. Zola began hosting small community gatherings for women who, like her, had lived through stigma or loneliness. She shared her story, not as a tale of tragedy, but as one of faith and triumph. She encouraged self-love, entrepreneurship, and prayer. The same woman who had once been shunned for her face had now become a voice of healing for others. Kwesi expanded his tutoring program into a community learning center. With donated books and desks made by a local carpenter, he created a space where children could learn without shame. His name, once dismissed and erased, was now spoken with respect. Despite everything they had lost, family, social standing, security, Kwesi and Zola had built a life greater than either could have imagined. A life not rooted in status, but in spirit. They eventually welcomed their first child, a baby girl with wide eyes and Zola's quiet strength. They named her Amara, which means grace. She grew up knowing a different kind of wealth, one made of warmth, struggle, and unwavering love. Kwesi and Zola's story was not written in gold, but in grit and sacrifice. And though their names may never appear in history books, their lives remain a powerful testament that love, when chosen and nurtured with intention, can heal what society breaks and build what others deem impossible.